I was sitting alone in my apartment on Christmas Eve when the message came through. The glow of the tiny tree I had decorated cast shadows on the wall, and the heavy scent of pine mixed with the comforting smell of my quiet evening routine. Outside Portland was silent, under a blanket of fresh snow, and the world felt suspended in that particular silence that only comes on holy nights. It was the kind of quiet that usually settled the soul. But tonight, it only amplified the anxiety I didn't know I was holding. The apartment felt smaller than usual. I had lived here for 3 years, a modest one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The radiator clanked and hissed a constant presence, and the floorboards creaked in places I had long since memorized, but it was mine. Every piece of second-hand furniture, every carefully chosen print on the wall, every book on the shelf they represented, choices I had made for myself, not compromises forced upon me by circumstance or family obligation. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and I picked it up expecting a holiday greeting from a coworker or perhaps an old friend. Instead, I found a message in the family group chat that would change the entire trajectory of my life. "It's best you step away for now." That was from my father. 7 words. They were delivered with surgical coldness, severing me instantly from the familiar connection of the group. There was no explanation, no warmth, no acknowledgement of the holiday or the season or the fact that I was his daughter. Just a cold dismissal on the night families were supposed to come together around tables laden with food and memories. I felt the initial shock, not in my head, but as a sharp physical retraction in my abdomen, the kind of visceral response that bypasses thought entirely and speaks directly to the body's ancient understanding of danger. I stared at the screen waiting for the ellipsis that would indicate someone was typing a clarification, an apology, anything to soften the blow. The seconds stretched into minutes. The Christmas lights continued their cheerful, oblivious blinking, reflecting off the dark window. Before I could process it, my mother added her own contribution. "Don't embarrass me. They are above your level." The words hit me like a physical shock, this one aimed not at my place in the family, but at my fundamental worth as a person. Above your level. As if I were a servant who had forgotten her station, as if 32 years of being their daughter could be reduced to a question of social adequacy. The Christmas lights blinked in their cheerful, oblivious rhythm, while something inside me went very still. It was the stillness of a mechanism that had suddenly shut down the constant motion of accommodation, finally irrevocably ceasing. For the first time, the endless reel of my financial sacrifices played in my mind, without the usual self-pity or immediate acceptance. I thought about all the years I had spent holding this family's necessities together, all the emergencies I had solved, all the debt I had quietly absorbed, the savings I had forfeited, so they could live comfortably. And this was what I received in return: a dismissal, an insult rooted in perceived social inadequacy. A clear statement that despite everything I had given the transactional nature of our relationship meant I would never be good enough for their true needs, their need for status and appearance. The depth of the calculation behind their ingratitude was the final profound shock. I set my phone down on the counter and walked to the window. The snow was still falling, thick flakes drifting down through the glow of the streetlights, like something from a Christmas card. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear carolers, their voices faint, but unmistakable, singing about joy and peace and goodwill toward men. The irony was not lost on me. I stood there for a long time, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill, watching my breath fog the glass in little clouds that appeared and disappeared like thoughts I couldn't quite hold on to. My reflection stared back at me. A woman of 32 with tired eyes and hair that needed washing, wearing a sweater she had owned for 6 years, because new clothes always seemed like an indulgence she couldn't justify. Who was this person? This woman who had spent her entire adult life propping up people who saw her as nothing more than a resource to be managed. When did I become so invisible that my own family could dismiss me with 7 words and an insult on Christmas Eve? Without a moment's hesitation, I typed back a single response after what felt like an eternity of staring at those cruel words. Understood. I'll respect that, and I'll step away from the family fun, too. The deliberate action of hitting send felt like throwing a stone into a deep well. I watched the message appear in the chat, watched the blue check marks indicate it had been delivered, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no fear, no regret. Just an immense, echoing emptiness where something else, love perhaps, or hope had once resided. Then I turned off my phone and went to bed. I did not cry. I did not rage. I simply lay in the darkness and listened to the silence of Christmas Eve and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. It was as if a door had closed, one that had been open my entire life, waiting for love that would never come through it. The closing was quiet, definitive, and heavy. Sleep came eventually, though I don't remember when. My dreams were fragmented things, images of doors and bridges and vast, empty rooms where voices echoed without source. When I woke, the gray light of Christmas morning was filtering through the curtains, and for a single merciful moment, I had forgotten everything. Then I reached for my phone. By morning, the external chaos matched the internal void. There were 88 missed calls, 7 voicemails, each more desperate than the last. The first one was from my father, his voice raw and trembling in a way I had never heard before, the fear utterly stripping him of his usual false authority. "Emily, what did you do?" "Everything's freezing. The accounts won't process. The insurance company rejected the payment. Fix this, Emily. Fix this right now." I listened to all 7 messages while slowly drinking my coffee, savoring the bitter warmth, and watching the snow continue to fall. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity, the clarity that comes when you finally see a pattern you should have recognized years ago. My mother's voice in the 3rd message was barely controlled. Panic, the veneer of refinement, entirely gone. "The pharmacy won't fill my prescription. They said the card was declined. Emily, what is happening?" The woman who had called me below their level just hours ago was now pleading, her voice cracking with the particular terror of someone who has always relied on systems they never bothered to understand. My sister's message was shorter, angrier, and laced with entitlement. "You selfish witch! You know I need that rent money. How could you do this to me?" No greeting. No acknowledgement that it was Christmas, just furious that the money she expected, the money she had always expected, as naturally as she expected the sun to rise, was suddenly impossibly not there. I did not fix it. I did not call back. Instead, I sent one final message to the family group chat, my fingers moving with the precision of an analyst executing a final trade. "I'm honoring your request to step away." The silence that followed was deafening in its completeness. No one responded. Perhaps they were too shocked. Perhaps they were scrambling. Perhaps for the first time in their lives they were confronting the reality that the person they had taken for granted had finally irrevocably stopped. That night, as I was preparing for bed, the consequence arrived not through me but through an external force. A knock came at my parents' door across town. A man named Daniel Reeves stood on their porch, his breath visible in the cold December air. He was from the Financial Integrity Unit, a division of the state's Financial Oversight Bureau. He had questions about accounts, about signatures, about a fund that bore my name, but seemed to have been accessed by people who were not me. When my mother called me in a panic later that evening, her voice was barely recognizable through the sheer terror. "The investigator is in our kitchen, Emily. He's asking about you. He says your name is all over the flagged documents. He wants to know about loans and applications and things we don't understand. What did you do to us?" I listened to her voicemail but did not call back. They wanted me gone. Now they would see what their world looked like without the invisible hand holding it together. "My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and I live alone in a modest apartment in Portland, Oregon. For most of my adult life, I have worked as a financial analyst at a logistics company downtown. I'm good at my job. I am organized and reliable and thorough. I notice discrepancies that others miss. I track patterns that others overlook. These are the same qualities that made me the unofficial bank for my entire family, the person they called whenever money was tight or emergencies arose or life became too complicated for them to handle. My father, Mark Carter, has never been able to hold a steady job for more than a year or two at a time. He dabbles in the stock market with money he does not have and dreams of wealth that never materializes. Every few years he makes a spectacular mistake with whatever savings they have managed to accumulate, and every few years I am the one who quietly cleans up the mess. My mother Diane is obsessed with appearances in a way that borders on pathological. She spends money they do not have on clothes that will impress the neighbors and furniture that will photograph well. And my older sister Vanessa is the golden child who can do no wrong despite failing at everything she touches. Every business she starts fails within a year, and every time without fail, I am expected to catch her when she falls. 4 years ago, I created the Carter Family Emergency Fund. It grew into a financial safety net that I maintained alone while they took from it freely. I set up automatic payments so they would never have to worry about utilities being shut off or insurance lapsing. No one ever thanked me. They simply expected it as if my sacrifice was as natural and unremarkable as the rising of the sun. This Christmas was supposed to be special. My mother wanted everything to be perfect, which apparently meant I needed to disappear. When I said I would step away from the fund, the silence was deafening. The fund was tied directly to my bank account. When I froze access to it, every automatic payment stopped. In one moment, the entire house of cards came tumbling down. The investigator changed everything. I had not filed any reports, but apparently someone had noticed irregularities in the fund, transactions that did not make sense, signatures that did not match, a loan application with my name on it that I had never authorized. I simply let them face the consequences of their own actions for the first time in their lives. That night alone in my apartment, I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Carter Financial History. Inside were 4 years of meticulous records, every receipt, every bank statement, every email I had exchanged with my family about money. I had kept everything, because some part of me, the part that dealt in facts and evidence, always knew this day would come. They thought they had cut me off. They did not realize I had been documenting everything. And the investigator had only uncovered the first layer of what they had done. I closed the laptop and stared out at the city lights. Somewhere across town, my family was falling apart, and for once I was not there to save them. I spent the next morning staring at the text messages from Christmas Eve, reading them over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less painful. They did not. My father's dismissal remained as cold as it had been the night before. My mother's cruelty still cuts just as deep. Outside my window, the world was gray and quiet. Snow had fallen overnight, and the streets of Portland were hushed under a white blanket. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, trying to understand how I had become someone my own family wanted to erase. The coffee was bitter, the ground stale from sitting too long in the cabinet. But I drank it anyway, grateful for something to do with my hands, something to anchor me to the physical world, while my mind spun in circles. But as I sat there, something new crept into my mind, something that hadn't fully surfaced the night before. It wasn't just that they wanted me gone. It was when and how they chose to say it. Christmas Eve. A night where being alone cuts deeper than any ordinary day. A night when even strangers reach out with kindness. My family chose that night to push me away, and when I thought about it like that, the entire situation shifted. It felt deliberate, timed. Like they wanted my absence to be absolute, emotionally, physically, and financially. They didn't just want me out of the celebration. They needed me out of the way of something else. The analyst in me, the part of my brain that spent its days tracking patterns and identifying anomalies, began to stir. Why Christmas Eve specifically? Why not earlier, when they first started planning the party? Why wait until the last possible moment to exclude me, unless the timing itself was part of a larger plan? Growing up, Vanessa had always been the star. I lived enough years in her shadow to know exactly where I stood. She got applause. I handled the aftermath. She basked in the attention. I managed the expectations no one would say out loud. And it stayed that way long after we grew up. I was 7 when I first understood the difference between us. Vanessa had won a local beauty pageant, and my parents threw a party to celebrate. The house was full of relatives and neighbors, all cooing over Vanessa's rhinestone crown and satin sash. I had won a spelling bee that same week. When I mentioned it to my grandmother, she patted my head and said, "That's nice, dear. Now go help your mother with the punch." That was the moment I learned that accomplishments could be invisible if they belonged to the wrong person. I was the reliable shadow, the one who didn't cause trouble, and therefore the one who didn't require attention. I remember once when I was 16 winning a statewide math competition. My mother's reaction was simply, "That's nice, dear. Don't mention it at dinner. Vanessa has an audition tomorrow and needs to focus." It wasn't malice, at least I didn't think so at the time. It was just a mechanical prioritizing that crushed my intrinsic worth. Now, sitting in my kitchen with cold coffee and a chilling clarity, I wondered if I had been wrong about the malice. My mother only reinforced the divide. She clung to how things appeared, not how they truly were. She always needed an audience, and Vanessa made the perfect leading act. I was the background noise, steady, reliable, easy to overlook. And in a family like ours, being reliable was dangerous. It meant they could place the weight on you, and keep placing it, and assume you'll never break. My father, for his part, avoided conflict so thoroughly that it became its own kind of cruelty. He was the classic enabler. When Vanessa caused chaos with a failed business venture, he didn't criticize. He just looked sad, forcing me to soften it with a check. When my mother demanded something irrational, like a sudden trip she couldn't afford, he didn't say no. He smoothed the edges and waited for me to step in. When I needed help, I was told to be patient, as though I hadn't already been patient my entire life. His passivity was an active betrayal, a tacit agreement that my role was permanent and non-negotiable. But none of that explained the rush to exile me before Christmas. None of that explained the icy precision in their words. It was too cold, too perfectly timed to be mere social maneuvering. The truth began to reveal itself slowly in pieces I didn't want to admit were connected. A few weeks before the holiday, my father casually asked if I still kept track of the accounts or if they ran themselves. His tone was light, but his eyes were too quick darting to my face, and then away the tell of a man who wanted information but didn't want to seem like he wanted it. He was fishing for something. I had dismissed it as his usual financial illiteracy. A week later, my mother brought up tax documents in another conversation, pretending she was cleaning old files, but she lingered on my Social Security number. She even asked if I had shredded a very old loan agreement I'd co-signed years ago for a refrigerator, an agreement I hadn't thought about in a decade. "Just organizing," she had said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then, just days before the Christmas party, Vanessa texted me asking if I still had the routing numbers written down somewhere, claiming she needed them for a personal payment. When I asked what payment, she changed the subject. Even then, I didn't think much of it. I dismissed it all as my family being scatterbrained and financially illiterate. But looking back over my coffee that morning, those scattered moments lined up like points on a graph, each one a clear signal I had missed a preparation phase for a move I couldn't comprehend at the time. They weren't just pushing me away. They were clearing the field. They needed me to be out of mind so I would be out of sight, and most critically, out of the way of the paperwork. And the moment I told them I was stepping away from the family fund, everything in their world began collapsing so fast it exposed the truth they had tried to hide. It wasn't the loss of my future financial contributions that panicked them. It was the immediate halt of their present active transactions. They needed me out so they could move without me noticing. The panic that followed wasn't grief. It wasn't a regret. It wasn't even confusing. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when a plan begins to fail, not because it was wrong, but because the person they counted on to stay silent finally stepped out of place. It was the fear of the guilty being exposed, not the sorrow of losing a loved one. I remembered all the years of quiet sacrifices, but I didn't revisit them in exact detail. They weren't the point anymore. The point was that those sacrifices had become so routine that my family believed they were entitled to them. That entitlement had grown into something else entirely, something darker, the belief that they were entitled to my identity as well. And when they realized I wasn't playing the same role anymore, their entire structure cracked. My phone buzzed with another voicemail from my mother. "The investigator is asking about you. He wants to see documents. Emily, what did you do?" What did I do? The irony would have made me laugh if it didn't hurt so much. I had done nothing except step back exactly as they told me to. And suddenly they couldn't hold their own lives together for even 24 hours. I didn't return the call. I didn't text back. I didn't try to soothe their panic the way I always had. Instead, I let the voicemail sit there while I opened the folder I'd kept on my laptop, quiet, private, methodical. 4 years of receipts, bank statements, screenshots, email copies. I didn't collect them out of suspicion, at least not consciously. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I kept them because a part of me, one I never wanted to admit existed, felt that eventually something would surface, something I'd need to understand with absolute clarity when the time came. I needed hard data to counteract their emotional gaslighting, the constant suggestion that I was remembering things wrong or exaggerating their need. And when it did, I would need proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Whatever the investigator was finding, it wasn't my doing. But it would almost certainly lead straight back to the people who had spent years convincing me that I owed them everything, while they planned to take more. And as the day moved on and the messages kept coming, one truth settled into place. They didn't want me gone because I was a problem. They wanted me gone because I was finally close to solving theirs. The morning after Christmas felt heavy before I even opened my eyes. My phone barely hanging on at 3% buzzed weakly beside me. 17 missed calls from my father, dozens of frantic texts from my mother, 3 voicemails from Vanessa. The sudden urgency from people who had pushed me away told me everything I needed to know. Something had gone very, very wrong. I plugged in the phone and watched the battery icon appear, then sat on the edge of my bed and waited. The apartment was cold. I had forgotten to adjust the thermostat before sleeping, and I pulled a blanket around my shoulders as I waited for the phone to charge enough to properly survey the damage. A fresh wave of notifications chimed as the phone charged. The investigator is asking questions about you about your accounts. My father's message flickered across the screen like a warning light. I read it 3 times, parsing each word. Not an investigator. The investigator. As if they already knew who he was, what he wanted. As if he was a presence they had been expecting or dreading. Portland outside my window was slush and gray, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and mood. Toast and coffee couldn't warm anything that morning. Snowmelt trickled along the gutters, while I imagined the atmosphere inside my parents' house, raised voices scrambling, explanations, panic rippling through every room. The sheer scale of their desperation was now clear. They had insisted I step away. Now their entire world was unraveling without the person who used to hold it together. My mother's voicemail played while I stared out the window. "Emily, please come. He's asking things we can't answer." The plea was purely transactional, a demand for the machine to resume function. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had said the night before, just the expectation that I would, as always, fix whatever had broken. Daniel Reeves, his name arrived in a text from an unknown number, a few hours later, had appeared on their doorstep Christmas night. The Financial Integrity Unit wasn't a place most people ever dealt with voluntarily. It sounded imposing and final, the ultimate consequence of their carelessness. Apparently, he'd come armed with a folder of documents my parents never expected anyone to examine closely. I sat with that information for a long time. A financial investigator, documents, questions. Something had triggered an official inquiry, and whatever it was serious enough to warrant a visit on Christmas night. Later I learned what unfolded in that kitchen pieced together from my father's panicked voicemails and eventually from Daniel himself. Daniel laid out statements, applications, email printouts, a precise display of evidence, then started asking questions that left no room to breathe. "Let's start simple," he said, tapping the first stack of documents. "Which one of you was actually handling the Carter Family Emergency Fund?" His finger moved to the column of automatic withdrawals. "And these recurring payments, whose responsibility were they?" Then he slid the loan file forward, the one with my forged signature. "One more thing. This application from November, who decided Emily approved it?" My parents tried improvising their answers, a desperate, tangled mess. "It's shared. We all contribute. Emily manages most of it." Their answers tripped over each other, flimsy and inconsistent, each one digging the hole deeper. They had operated in a gray area of assumption for so long that they couldn't distinguish their story from the facts. They had taken from the fund so freely, so casually, that they had forgotten or perhaps never acknowledged that every dollar in it came from a single source: me. Daniel didn't buy a word of it. He had already traced every deposit back to one source: me. Every outgoing payment, every automated transaction, every linked account. There was no ambiguity. The data trail was a straight line leading from my generosity to their expectation. So when he asked why I would apply for a loan without notifying anyone, silence fell like a dropped curtain. My mother cried. My father froze the conflict he always avoided now squarely in his lap. Vanessa shrank into the couch, the golden child's shine dulled by sheer fear. None of them had expected the questions to lead back to a signature I never made. They had counted on my silence, my loyalty, and my immediate return to clean up the mess. They had counted on the same thing they had always counted on: Emily will fix it. But Emily wasn't there, and for the first time they had to face questions they couldn't answer, with borrowed money and convenient lies. Meanwhile, my apartment felt strangely peaceful compared to the storm brewing across town. A few odd moments from the past months replayed themselves with uncomfortable clarity. Sharper now, like photos brought into focus, a bank alert about an unfamiliar login. I had checked it, found nothing obviously wrong, and dismissed it. Vanessa called instantly after that alert, urging me to ignore it, her voice too casual. "Those things are always false alarms," she had said. "I get them all the time." My father showed sudden, uncharacteristic interest in whether I remained primarily on the accounts, asking with forced, awkward joviality. "You're still the main name on everything, right, kiddo? Good to have the responsible one in charge." My mother's sudden organizational questions about old tax forms seemingly focused on dates and account numbers. "I'm just trying to get everything in order," she had claimed, though she had never shown interest in organization before. Individually, the moments had seemed harmless, easily dismissed as financial confusion. Together, the patterns sharpened, forming a timeline of preparation and deceit. Their request for me to skip Christmas wasn't about embarrassment. It was about access. Removing me cleared the path for whatever paperwork they were working on behind the scenes, ensuring I wouldn't intercept alerts or ask questions about new files. A new text appeared on my screen that afternoon. "This is Daniel Reeves, Financial Integrity Unit. I need to speak with you. Can you come to our office tomorrow morning?" I read the message 3 times. Then I typed 2 words. The gravity of the decision setting into my bones. "I'll come." That night, my laptop glowed in the dim kitchen as the folder labeled Carter Financial History opened. Years of receipts, statements, screenshots, forwarded emails, organized, dated, cross-checked. The habit began after one pharmacy error years ago that my mother turned into a sudden vicious accusation. She had claimed I was cheating them, holding back money that should have gone to her medication. I had shown her the receipts proved my innocence, but the accusation had stung. After that, I kept everything. Every transaction, every email, every text about money. Keeping proof became self-defense against her emotional manipulation. Those documents, once just a way to stay sane, had suddenly become a shield and potentially a weapon. Another text from my mother arrived close to midnight. "What did you do to us?" My internal reply was cold, simple. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Stepping back had simply exposed everything they'd built on my name, the precarious tower of debt and entitlement collapsing under its own weight. This time I wasn't running toward the fire to put it out. The smoke was theirs. Let them breathe it. The next morning, I drove to the Financial Integrity Unit through streets still glazed with ice. The building was nondescript, a gray block of offices in a part of the city I rarely visited. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with an impersonal drone, and the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. It felt like the kind of place where facts stripped of all emotion came to die. I checked in at the front desk, gave my name, and sat in a plastic chair. The waiting area was empty except for me. Motivational posters lined the walls. Integrity is our foundation. Truth builds trust. The kind of corporate sentiment that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Daniel Reeves met me in a small conference room. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with a serious face and careful eyes that seemed to absorb every detail. He wore a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers, no tie, no attempt at intimidation, just quiet competence. He had a thick folder in front of him and a notepad covered in small, precise handwriting, a sign of the meticulous mind that had already disrupted my family's world. "Thank you for coming, Emily. I appreciate you making the time, especially given the circumstances." His voice was calm, professional, neither warm nor cold. "I need to understand your side of things." I told him about the fund, how I had created it 4 years ago to help with my mother's medical bills when she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and the costs of her medication threatened to overwhelm them. How it had quickly grown into something larger, an indispensable financial safety net for my entire family. I detailed how I had meticulously set up automatic payments for their insurance, their prescriptions, their mortgage, and Vanessa's often late rent. I kept my voice flat, professional, reciting facts as if I were reviewing a client portfolio. It was easier that way. If I treated it like work, I could get through it without breaking down. Daniel listened without interrupting. He made notes occasionally, but mostly he just watched me, gauging my reaction, searching for inconsistency. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, the sound of the leather, a sudden break in the silence. "Did you authorize any loan application in November?" "No." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. He pushed a document across the table. "There's a problem, Emily. Someone submitted an application for $80,000 using the fund as collateral and listing you as the primary guarantor. The bank flagged it because the signature didn't match your records." $80,000. The number hammered the air out of my lungs, stealing my breath. My peripheral vision narrowed, and I felt the blood drain from my face. That was more money than I made in a year, a catastrophic sum that could destroy my stable, carefully constructed life. The idea that someone had tried to borrow that much using my name left me struggling to breathe, the very air in the room suddenly too thin. It was the moment the financial abuse turned into identity theft. 80,000, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "They tried to borrow $80,000 in my name." "That's correct." Daniel opened his folder and spread documents across the table. I recognized some of them bank statements from the fund copies of automatic payments I had set up, but there were other alien things too. A credit card application I had never seen, a registration for something called Carter Renewal Center, LLC, and page after page of emails between members of my family. "Your family has been using your information for longer than you think. These records go back over a year." I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of the dizzying, nauseating reality. Medical bills with my name as guarantor. A car lease for Vanessa using my name as the primary guarantor. A credit card opened 14 months ago that I knew nothing about, used mostly for expensive clothes and restaurant bills my mother's tastes. They didn't just ask me for money. They systematically stole my identity. The realization hit me with the weight of physical grief. I had known they were entitled. I had known they were ungrateful. But this was something else entirely. This was calculated, deliberate fraud. Daniel nodded. "They've been treating your credit as their own. Small transactions at first. Things that wouldn't trigger immediate alerts. But the loan application in November was the tipping point. That's what got our attention." He showed me a screenshot of a bank rejection notice. The loan had been denied because the bank's digital signature analysis flagged inconsistencies. Someone had tried to forge my name and they had failed. "Who submitted this?" Daniel pointed to the applicant line. "Vanessa Carter." Of course it was Vanessa. The golden child, utterly entitled, who had never worked for anything in her life. The sister who saw me not as family, but as an unlimited renewable resource. The realization hit me with the weight of physical grief. I had spent my entire life supporting her. I had paid her debts, cleaned up her messes, smoothed over her failures, And in return, she had tried to steal my identity to saddle me with debt I would never have agreed to use my good name as collateral for her endless catastrophic failures. There's more. We recovered some deleted emails from the accounts involved. They show coordination between your sister, your mother, and someone else, a woman named Linda in Kansas. Aunt Linda? My mother's sister. I had not spoken to her in years. She had her own financial problems, her own history of failed schemes and debt. The coordination was starting to look less like family desperation and more like organized fraud. I remembered Aunt Linda from family gatherings when I was young, a woman who always seemed to have a new business idea, a new investment opportunity, a new sure thing that would make everyone rich. She had moved to Kansas after a divorce and a bankruptcy and gradually faded from our lives. I hadn't thought about her in years. We're still piecing everything together, but it looks like this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. They planned this. They gathered your information over time. And when you stepped away from the fund on Christmas Eve, you disrupted whatever they were trying to do. I sat in silence processing the scale of the betrayal. My family had not just taken advantage of me. They had systematically stolen my identity. They had used my good credit, my professional reputation to prop up their failing lives. Why would they want me gone from Christmas? If they needed my information, why push me away? Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. That's what we're trying to figure out. But my guess, they wanted you out of the picture entirely so you wouldn't intercept alerts, ask questions, or notice the forged documents. You stepped away from the fund, and suddenly all their schemes started collapsing because the access point your control vanished. My phone buzzed. Another message from my mother. The utilities were shut down. Your sister's car is uninsured. If you let this happen, I'm finished with you. I turned off my phone and looked at Daniel, the last thread of emotional attachment snapping. What happens now? We continue the investigation. With your cooperation, we can build a case. But Emily, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Your family isn't going to admit what they did. I thought about my mother's accusations, my father's desperation, Vanessa's threats. They were already fighting the consequences. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just ready to fight back. I was ready to fight for myself. I have documentation, 4 years of records, every payment I made, every email I sent, everything. Daniel's eyebrows rose, a flicker of genuine respect finally visible. You've been keeping records. I started after my mother blamed me for a pharmacy error. I wanted proof that I was doing my part. It became a defense mechanism. That kind of documentation could change everything. It turned suspicion into evidence. Can you bring it to our next meeting? I'll bring everything. As I left the building, my phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel. We found something in the deleted emails. You'll want to see this. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold air, the truth solidifying around me. This was no longer just a family argument. This was a coordinated, premeditated scheme, a plan that had been building for months, and I was finally going to face the truth armed with proof. I spent the evening organizing my records, 4 years of documentation spread across my kitchen table like evidence at a trial, bank statements highlighted in yellow, email printouts sorted by date, a spreadsheet tracking every single dollar I had sent to my family, labeled meticulously with the purpose and the recipient. The work took hours, but I welcomed the tedium. It gave my hands something to do, while my mind processed what I had learned. Every receipt I handled was a small act of validation, proof that I had been generous, that I had tried, that my memory of giving and giving and giving was not a delusion or an exaggeration. When I looked at it all laid out, the pattern was undeniable. I had given them everything, my stability, my savings, my credit score. And they had given me nothing but contempt and eventual betrayal in return. The sheer volume of my generosity stood as a silent witness against their cruelty. The total, when I calculated it, made me sit down heavily in my chair, $127, $463 over 4 years. Not including the automatic payments for their mortgage insurance and utilities. Just the direct transfers, the emergency bailouts, the debts I had paid off. More than a third of my total income went to people who had repaid me with fraud. The next morning, I arrived at Daniel's office with a thick folder under my arm. He was already waiting the remnants of a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. His expression was more serious than before, suggesting the information he'd found was significant. "Before we start, I need to show you something." He pulled up a document on his computer. It was an email recovered from Vanessa's deleted folder, a message that confirmed their cold calculation. From Vanessa Carter to Diane Carter. Subject application draft. Mom just use her info. Emily never checks. She won't mind. She always pays eventually. I read the words 3 times before they truly sank in. Just use her info. It was casual dismissive, the way one talks about borrowing a useless tool. As if my identity was community property. As if my credit score was something they could simply borrow without asking. The entitlement was breathtaking. This was sent 6 weeks before Christmas, before the loan application, before the messages telling you to step away. He opened another email. This one was from my father to Vanessa, a gut punch delivered in his typical passive style. "She's too soft. Don't push her. She'll break. Just let your mom handle her." I remembered all the times my father had called me the strong one, the rock of the family, and here he was explaining to my sister the exact emotional weakness to exploit how to manipulate me without him having to directly participate. His inaction was a deliberate strategy. "There's more." Daniel clicked to another message, a concrete detail of their corporate fraud. From Vanessa Carter to Diane Carter. Subject business plan. "I'm calling it Carter Renewal Center. If Emily co-signs, we can get the $80,000 loan approved. She won't know it's all online." Carter Renewal Center, the LLC registration I had seen in Daniel's folder, a fake business created specifically to borrow money in my name, a flimsy facade for Vanessa's perpetual failures. Daniel leaned back. "Your sister's yoga studio went bankrupt 8 months ago. She's been trying to start something new, but no bank will lend to her. Her credit is destroyed. So she decided to use yours instead. She didn't just ask for money, she tried to become the person who had it." I felt like I was watching someone else's life, a terrible documentary about betrayal. These could not be my family. These could not be the people I had sacrificed everything for. But there was still more to see. Daniel showed me a 4th email, the one that hurt most of all because it confirmed the orchestration of my deepest pain. From Diane Carter to Mark Carter. Subject before Christmas. If she asks, just tell her to rest. Let her leave the fund. We need her off the account so we can handle the paperwork. Don't say anything that makes her suspicious. They had orchestrated my exile. The messages telling me to step away, the comments about embarrassing them, the suggestion that I was not good enough for Vanessa's boyfriend. It was all a cold, calculated strategy to clear the way for forgery. They wanted me out of the way so they could steal from me without my knowledge, timing it perfectly during a busy holiday season. Daniel watched me process this flood of information. When you told them you were stepping away from the fund, you disrupted their entire plan. They needed you gone, but they needed your name on the new applications. Your stepping away shut down the active financial link, making the forgery attempts much more visible. I stood up the chair, scraping sharply on the floor. I didn't feel rage. I felt a chilling, absolute clarity. He nodded. "You stood up." I looked at the folder I had brought, 4 years of records documenting my generosity, my sacrifice, my misguided love for people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be managed and depleted. I pulled out the spreadsheets and handed them to Daniel. "This is everything. Every payment, every transfer, every email. I have dates, amounts, account numbers. You have the emails showing their intent. Now you have the evidence of my actions proving my innocence." Daniel flipped through the pages, his professional demeanor momentarily slipping into awe. "Emily, this is remarkable. Most victims don't have this level of documentation. This turns a difficult case into a strong one. This could make the difference between a case that stalls and a case that succeeds. I was not trying to build a case. I just wanted proof that I was doing my part against their constant claims that I wasn't enough." Daniel met my eyes. "Well, now it's proof of what they were doing too." My phone buzzed. More messages from my family. More demands. More accusations. I glanced at the screen and saw Vanessa's latest text. If you talk to anyone else, I'll tell them everything was your idea." I showed it to Daniel. He shook his head. "She's scared. They all are. When people get caught, they stop rationalizing and start threatening. What happens now? Now we keep digging. There's a piece we're still missing. A fourth person who accessed the files. Someone logging in from Kansas, checking the files and retrieving old documents." Aunt Linda, "Exactly. We need to understand her role in all this. She may have provided the expertise for the fraud itself." As I left his office, my phone rang. My mother's number. I let it go to voicemail. "Emily, we need to talk. Don't let them destroy our family. Please, just come home." Home. The word tasted like ash, as if that word meant anything anymore when it was defined by exploitation. I deleted the voicemail and drove back to my apartment. That night I sat by my window and watched the city lights flicker in the darkness. My family was falling apart, and for the first time I was not rushing to save them. The relief was a subtle, strange sensation, like finally being able to hear my own thoughts clearly. The rain returned the next day, a steady drizzle that turned the city gray and indistinct. I drove to Daniel's office through streets slick with water, my windshield wipers keeping time like a metronome against the drumming anxiety that now mixed with a hard-won resolve. He was waiting with a USB drive in his hand. "We recovered more deleted files. This is the link we were missing. You need to see this." The first email made me physically ill, not from shock, but from the brutal confirmation of their intent, from Linda Morrison to Diane Carter and Vanessa Carter. Subject: use her credit quietly, she owes you anyway. Push her out of the family fund so she stops watching the numbers. Once she steps away, use her social security number for the loan, she won't catch it. I've helped others with similar messes. It works if you time it right. My aunt, my mother's sister, a woman I had not spoken to in years. She wasn't just a willing participant. She was the architect of the scheme, offering her criminal expertise. Daniel scrolled down. There was more, the cruelest lines yet. "Don't let her get suspicious. Keep her feeling guilty. She's always been easy to manipulate. Remind her she needs to contribute more." I read the words over and over. Keep her feeling guilty. That phrase defined my entire adult life. All those years of being told I was not doing enough, not caring enough, not giving enough. It was not disappointment. It was strategy. They had weaponized my deepest insecurity, my desire for their love and approval, and used it to maintain control. They had been manipulating me my entire life, not just for money, but for compliance. The realization was utterly sickening. I thought about all the times I had felt inadequate, all the times I had pushed myself harder, worked more hours, saved less money for myself because I believed I wasn't doing enough. Every time my mother sighed and said, "I suppose we'll manage somehow." Every time my father mentioned how hard things were, every time Vanessa cried about her latest disaster, they were playing me, pulling strings I didn't even know existed. The next email was my mother's response confirming her role as chief manipulator. "Emily won't leave. She's too loyal. But if she does, we keep her information active. It's safer if she doesn't know." And then Vanessa. "Don't worry, she'll do what she always does, pay for the mess." Daniel let me sit with the emails in silence, allowing the sheer weight of the treachery to settle. Finally, he pulled up another file, a financial blueprint. "This one is harder to look at. It's the monetization of your betrayal." It was a spreadsheet. Projected disbursement after loan approval. I scanned the columns. $80,000 broken down into categories: $42,000 for Vanessa's failed business debts, $18,000 for credit card balances my mother's spending, $12,000 set aside as a contingency fund, and at the bottom a line that made my blood run cold, a chilling summation of their moral calculus: Linda $5,000 commission. They were going to pay her for helping them steal from me her own niece. Daniel nodded. "This wasn't desperation, Emily. This was a business arrangement. Your aunt provided the expertise, and they agreed to cut her in on the proceeds. They treated your financial ruin as a transaction." I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be good enough for my family, all the sacrifices I had made, all the times I had put their needs before my own, And the whole time they had been planning this, meticulously calculating the cost of my destruction. There's one more thing. We traced a login to the files from Kansas and then a travel record. Your aunt flew to Portland 2 weeks before Christmas. She met with your mother and sister at a quiet coffee shop downtown. The meeting lasted nearly an hour too long for just catching up. So they coordinated in person. They laid out the final plan. It appears so. Whatever they planned, they didn't want a digital trail for the most sensitive details. My phone buzzed. 50 missed calls in 2 hours. My family had moved past panic into genuine stark desperation. My mother's latest text read, "You don't understand how hard we tried. Stop the investigation." I showed it to Daniel. He shook his head. "They're not sorry for what they did. They're sorry they got caught. The emphasis is always on their struggle, not your damage." He was right. In all of their messages, not a single one had included an apology or asked about my well-being. There's still a piece missing, the email chain that started all of this. We know Linda gave them instructions, but we don't know how the conversation began. We're trying to restore a file that was overwritten multiple times. Do you think it was my aunt who came up with the idea? I think your aunt provided the expertise, but someone in your family initiated the idea the moment they decided to target your identity instead of just your income. Someone decided to target you before anyone else got involved. I thought about my mother's coldness, my father's passivity, Vanessa's entitlement. Any one of them could have been the architect of the scheme. The final horrifying truth was still hidden. Daniel, can you restore that file? We're working on it. It's the final piece of the puzzle. When we do, you'll be the first to know. That night, I sat in my apartment and listened to the rain against my windows. My phone had gone silent. Either my family had given up or they were planning their next, possibly more chaotic move. Daniel sent me a text late that evening. When you see what we found, everything changes. The final email is restored. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I set my phone aside and waited for morning, ready for the final, devastating reveal. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cruel phrases, "Keep her feeling guilty." She's always been easy to manipulate. The psychological damage felt sharper than the financial one. The financial theft could be calculated, documented, eventually recovered. But the emotional manipulation, the systematic exploitation of my desire for their love that left wounds no spreadsheet could quantify. By morning, I was exhausted but alert. Something essential had shifted inside me. The residual grief was still there, but it was being rapidly replaced by something harder, a focused, self-protective resolve. Daniel called just after 9. We restored the file. It's fragmented, but the initial message is clear. You need to come in. I drove through empty streets, the city still waking up around me. The building looked the same as always, but I felt different walking through its doors. I was no longer the confused victim waiting for answers. I was a woman ready to face the truth, however ugly. Daniel was waiting with his laptop open, his expression grim. This is the original email chain, the one that started everything. It dates back to last May. I read the first message and felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the final illusion shattering. From Diane Carter to Linda Morrison and Vanessa Carter. Subject: running out of options. Emily's idea. Linda, the doctor bills are piling up, and Vanessa's debts are catastrophic. We need $80K to clear everything and keep the house. I know you've been creative before. Emily keeps tight control over her savings. Is there a way we can use her good credit for a loan without her noticing? She told me once she kept old signed documents in a box. The opening line was the final devastating blow from Diane Carter, my mother. The one who preached about appearances, who claimed to care about family above all else. She was the architect. She initiated the idea. I read the words again, searching for some other interpretation, some way to understand them that didn't mean what they clearly meant. But there was no ambiguity. My mother had reached out to her sister, asking for help in stealing from me. She had done it first. She had started this. Daniel scrolled down to show me the replies. From Linda Morrison, I know you've been struggling. Here's what you need to do. Push Emily out of the fund management so she's not watching the numbers anymore. Once she steps away, use her social security number to apply for the business loan. She'll never catch it if you time it right. I've done this before with my ex-husband's information. It works. The casual admission I've done this before turned my stomach. My aunt wasn't just advising them on how to commit fraud. She had experience. She had done this to someone else, someone who had trusted her. From Diane Carter, Emily's loyal, but we can make her feel guilty enough to step back. She always thinks she's not doing enough. We just have to push those buttons. And then Vanessa. The Christmas party is perfect. We can tell her she's not good enough for Derek's family. That'll hurt enough to make her withdraw. I know where she keeps that old file of signed papers. They had weaponized my insecurities, my deepest desire for acceptance. They had used the Christmas party, the ultimate symbol of family unity, as a cruel strategic backdrop for my betrayal. But the most devastating part was my mother's final reply in that segment, from Diane Carter to Linda Morrison. The loan application is ready. We just need her signature. Vanessa found a way to copy it from some old documents Emily signed years ago. We're submitting it next week. They had forged my signature. They had taken old documents preserved by my mother's meticulous pathological need for order and used them to fake my authorization. Daniel watched me carefully, his face unreadable. Emily, this is fraud. Organized, premeditated fraud. We have enough evidence to pursue charges against all of them. The intent, the conspiracy, and the execution are all documented. I stared at the screen. My mother had coordinated the manipulation. My aunt had provided the expertise. My sister had executed the forgery. Daniel, what about my father? His role is harder to pin down. He knew what was happening, and based on some other recovered notes, he actively assisted in locating the old co-signed documents for them. He enabled it through his silence and selective help, but legally his liability is murkier. Does it matter? My voice was quiet, hollow. He knew and did nothing. That's a betrayal of its own kind. It matters for the legal case, but I understand what you're saying. My phone buzzed. Another message from Vanessa Raw, panic replacing her bravado. You think Daniel cares about you? He's using you. Stop this before you destroy everyone. I showed it to Daniel. He shook his head slowly. They're terrified now. When the evidence is this strong, people start trying anything to regain control. I thought about the years I had spent protecting these people, and all the while, they had been planning to destroy me. What do I do now? Daniel pulled out a stack of forms. If you want to pursue this, you can file a formal complaint. With your documentation and our evidence, we can build a strong, successful case. This is your chance to draw the line. I looked at the papers. They represented a choice that would permanently shatter my world, but it was a world that was already broken beyond repair. I could walk away, try to forget, and live in fear of the next scheme, or I could fight back and reclaim my name and my future. I picked up a pen. Where do I sign? The question was calm, firm, the voice of the financial analyst taking charge of her own most critical account. 2 days later, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since Christmas. The air was cold and still. The street looked the same as it always had. The same mailbox slightly crooked from the time my father backed into it and never fixed it. The same cracked sidewalk, the same overgrown hedges, the same front porch where I had spent so many childhood afternoons. But I was not the same person who had grown up here, and I was not coming home. I was coming to confront the people who had tried to destroy me with surgical precision. I parked on the street instead of the driveway, a small act of separation that felt significant. As I walked toward the house, I noticed details I had overlooked for years. The peeling paint on the shutters, the dying plants in the front flower bed, the general air of neglect that spoke to a household more concerned with appearances than maintenance. I could hear arguing before I reached the door. Raised voices, accusations flying back and forth, a desperate scramble to pin the blame on anyone but themselves. My family was already falling apart under the weight of the investigation. I walked in without knocking the USB drive containing the evidence, a small, heavy weight in my pocket. The living room went silent instantly. The familiar Christmas-themed clutter seemed suddenly cheap and tawdry. My mother was standing by the fireplace, her face streaked with tears and exhaustion. My father sat rigid in his usual chair, looking smaller, older, the reality of his inaction finally crushing his false composure. Vanessa was curled on the couch, mascara running down her cheeks, her golden child veneer completely shattered. No one said hello. They just stared at me, the ghost of their former benefactor, as if I were a stranger who had walked into a private wake. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and held it up, letting the cold plastic catch the light. I know everything. My mother's face went from pale to ashen. What are you talking about, Emily? Please, stop being dramatic. The emails, the loan applications, the forged signatures, Linda's commission, the entire plan orchestrated by you, Mom, back in May, all of it. Daniel has it all. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Then, true to form, everyone started talking at once, the chaos, the only language they knew. My mother reached for me, her hands trembling. Emily, you have to understand. We were desperate. Vanessa's creditors were threatening us. We had no other choice. No other choice? You had choices. You could have asked me for help and I would have helped you. You could have been honest. Instead, you stole my identity, my credit, my future. You chose to destroy me rather than admit your failure. Vanessa's voice was shrill, laced with victimhood. You have a stable life. I have nothing. I was going to lose everything. You were supposed to help me. You always did. I am not your piggy bank. I am not your backup plan. I am your sister, and you tried to destroy me to fund your pathetic failures. My father finally spoke, his voice barely a rasp. Emily, please. We can fix this as a family. Don't let this go outside the house. I looked at him with something between pity and contempt. You knew what they were doing, Dad. You stood by and watched while they forged my signature and planned my betrayal. You prioritized avoiding conflict over protecting your daughter. I didn't know how far it went. I thought it was just borrowing a little money. And that it would all work out, that I would never find out you knew enough, Dad. You were complicit. He had no answer. I pulled out my phone and showed them the spreadsheet Daniel had found. The projected disbursement. $80,000 for Vanessa's debts, $12,000 for Mother's shopping, $5,000 for Linda's criminal consultation fee. You were going to split the money you stole from me. You were already spending it. My mother sank into a chair, her facade crumbling completely. We needed help. You always had more than us. It was unfair. Unfair. The word came out as a bitter laugh. I had more because I worked for it. I had more because I didn't blow my money on appearances and bad investments. I had more because I sacrificed everything to help you, and you still wanted more. The room erupted into chaos. Vanessa blamed my mother for the pressure. My mother blamed Linda for the idea. My father blamed everyone while accepting no responsibility himself. I watched them turn on each other and felt nothing but an immense quiet emptiness. The last vestiges of my hope for a real family died right there in that living room. When the shouting finally died down, my mother tried one more time, grasping at the final emotional lever she had. Emily, please, don't do this. Think about what it will mean for our family. Think about your name on the police reports. What family? I met her eyes, my own dry and steady. You pushed me away. You told me I wasn't good enough. You used my information to commit fraud. There is no family here. There is just a group of people who exploited me. My phone rang. It was Daniel. I stepped outside onto the porch to take the call, the cold December air a welcome change from the toxic heat inside. Emily, the investigation just escalated. We found something tied to your Social Security number from last week, an attempted major transaction even after you cut them off. You need to come in tomorrow. I looked back through the window at my family. They were still arguing, still blaming each other, still refusing to take responsibility. I'll be there. That night, I drove back to my apartment and sat in the dark. For the first time in my life, I was not trying to fix things. I was just letting the consequences unfold. I was finally free of the burden of saving them. The next morning was the calmest I had felt in weeks. Not peaceful exactly, but like the profound stillness before a storm makes landfall. I knew the final confrontation was imminent, and I was ready for it, grounded in the certainty of my decision. Daniel was waiting when I arrived at his office. His expression was graver than I had ever seen. "Emily, sit down. This is bigger than we thought. They didn't stop even after the investigator showed up." He turned his laptop to face me. On the screen was a rejected credit application. $40,000. A business credit line for Carter Renewal Center, LLC. Primary applicant, Vanessa Carter. Co-signer, Emily Carter. The application had been submitted 3 days after I told them I was stepping away from the fund, 3 days after the investigator first knocked on their door. They tried again, even after I cut them off, even under investigation. Daniel nodded. "The device used to submit this application was your mother's phone, but the timestamp doesn't match her location. She was at a doctor's appointment when this was filed. The application was submitted from their house. So someone else used her phone. They were that desperate. We traced the login. It was Vanessa. She used your mother's Face ID while she was sleeping to submit the application, hoping for one last cash grab before the accounts were completely frozen. It shows a reckless desperation." I thought about my sister. The golden child now revealed as a common thief willing to steal from her own mother just to steal from me. There's more. We pulled Vanessa's bank records. In the weeks before the big loan application, she made several large transfers. $3,000 to a wellness retreat in Arizona, $1,800 for marketing for a business that doesn't exist, and $2,500 to a consulting fee for your Aunt Linda. She was spending money she didn't have counting on the loan. Exactly. She was spending money she expected to get from you. The $80,000 loan was supposed to cover all of it, her spending her debts, and the fees for the criminal operation. He showed me another document, a timeline connecting all the events. Vanessa's studio went bankrupt in March. My mother's first email to Linda in May. The coordination meeting in Portland in December. The Christmas messages. The initial loan application. The confrontation. And then the final desperate application from Vanessa's hand using her sleeping mother's phone. It was all connected. A months-long coordinated scheme designed to exploit my credit and leave me holding the debt, culminating in a last-ditch frantic fraud attempt. What happens now? Daniel pulled out a stack of legal forms. With this evidence, the documented conspiracy, the 2 separate forgery attempts, and the financial trail, you can file a formal identity fraud complaint. This will trigger a criminal investigation. Your sister will be the primary target for the forgery, but your mother and aunt will also face serious consequences for conspiracy and attempted fraud. And my father. His role is murkier. He knew what was happening, but may not have directly participated in the key criminal actions. His liability is civil, but less certain criminally. I looked at the forms. This was the moment of truth, the final step beyond which there was no retreat. Once I signed, there was no going back to the old roles, the old family dynamic. But they had been willing to destroy my life first. They had already signed their own fate. I picked up the pen and signed every form, my hand steady, my resolve unwavering. Daniel gathered the papers. "That's the right call, Emily. You're protecting yourself and ensuring they face accountability." As I left his office, my phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa, clearly sent after she realized the gravity of my meeting with Daniel. "If you go through with this, I'll tell the investigator something that will ruin you. You have no idea what I know." I stared at the message. It was a threat, a hollow, empty gesture of a desperate child. Vanessa had nothing on me because I had done nothing wrong except be too generous. I texted back 3 words, a final boundary set in stone. "Try me, Vanessa." Then I turned off my phone and drove home finally at peace with the knowledge that I had chosen self-preservation over self-destruction. The morning I had been waiting for arrived with a clear, sharp inevitability. The sky was bright, the air crisp, and I felt a strange sense of peace as I prepared for what would be the most difficult day of my life, yet also the most liberating. Daniel had called the night before. "We're ready to present the formal findings to your family. It's an opportunity for them to hear the facts without the ability to manipulate the narrative. Do you want to be there?" I did, not to gloat, but because I needed to see their faces when the truth, my truth backed by data, was finally laid bare, and I needed to be the one to hear the final formal separation. I arrived at my parents' house to find Daniel already there with a colleague, a specialist in identity theft cases. They had set up at the dining room table with folders and laptops, turning the dining room into a makeshift interrogation room. My family was gathered like defendants waiting for sentencing. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her jewelry looking tragically out of place. My father stared intently at the floor, avoiding all eye contact. Vanessa was huddled on the couch, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, her body language radiating defeat. I took a seat across from them and said nothing, my presence a silent, final accusation. Daniel started the presentation with the clinical detachment of a financial auditor. He began with the loan application, $80,000, the forged signature, the bank's rejection. Then he moved to the shadow accounts, the credit card opened in my name, the car lease listing me as co-signer, the timeline of the transfers my mother had initiated without my knowledge. With each revelation, my family's composure crumbled faster. My mother's tears flowed freely, not tears of remorse, but of sheer panic at the loss of control. My father's hands shook violently on his knees. Vanessa looked physically ill. Finally, Daniel displayed the spreadsheet showing the monetary calculation of their betrayal, how they had planned to divide the money. The line item for Linda's commission drew a sharp, involuntary gasp from my mother. "You were going to pay her to help you steal from me," I stated, my voice low and steady. It wasn't a question. My mother started to protest, her voice cracking. "We were desperate. You don't understand, the debts were too high." Daniel cut her off, his tone formal and final. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, Vanessa, I need to inform you that based on the evidence, formal criminal charges will be pursued. Your daughter has filed a comprehensive identity fraud complaint. This is now a criminal matter." The room went silent, the air thick with disbelief. My father finally looked up, his face etched with sudden, profound fear. "Criminal charges, Emily, please. We're your family. We can't let this happen." I met his eyes, allowing him to see the complete detachment there. "You stopped being my family when you forged my signature, when you planned to saddle me with catastrophic debt I didn't know about. That's not family, that's just parasitism." Vanessa broke down into loud, hysterical sobs. "I needed the money. I was going to lose everything. You were supposed to help me. You always did. I was supposed to help you by letting you destroy my credit, my career, my future. You didn't want help, Vanessa. You wanted a patsy, a perpetual safety net that never ran dry." My father tried one more time, his last pathetic attempt to regain control. "If you press charges, you'll destroy this family. You'll ruin us all." I looked around the room at the broken, self-serving people who had once been my whole world. This family destroyed itself back in May, Mom and Dad. I'm just finally walking away from the wreckage and ensuring my own future is salvaged. Daniel's colleague began gathering documents, the action signaling the end of the meeting. Daniel stood up. "I'll be in touch regarding next steps. I strongly recommend each of you retain legal counsel immediately." He and his colleague left. I stayed for one more moment, looking at the broken people who had once been my world. The silence this time was truly final, a chasm that would never be crossed. Then I walked out the door and did not look back, the cold air outside feeling like a tonic. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, official notifications, and the tedious, necessary work of fraud reversal. Daniel kept me updated on the investigation's progress. Each conversation brought new revelations, new confirmation of what I had always suspected but never wanted to believe. The formal findings were devastating. Every scheme my family had concocted was documented in meticulous detail. The loan applications, the forged signatures, the coordinated emails, the shadow accounts. My records provided the unassailable truth. Vanessa was identified as the primary perpetrator. She had initiated the major fraud attempts, executed the forgeries, and managed the illicit spending. Daniel confirmed she would face criminal charges and significant civil penalties. Her golden child status had finally dissolved into a legal nightmare. My mother was classified as a key conspirator and cooperator bearing substantial responsibility for planning and emotional manipulation. She would face severe civil penalties and would be required to make restitution. The facade of the respectable suburban wife had been legally stripped away. Aunt Linda received notification from the Kansas Fraud Unit. Her role as criminal advisor and designated beneficiary had been documented. She would not escape consequences either. And my father was formally found to have known about the scheme and failed to report it, making him complicit. His liability was limited, but not absent. Confirming his moral failure was also a minor legal one. I received official notification that I had been cleared of any wrongdoing. The investigation confirmed what I had always known: I was a victim, not a participant. My credit would be protected. The fraudulent transactions would be reversed. My name would be cleared, restored to its integrity. My mother called when she received her legal notice. Her voice was barely recognizable, stripped of its demanding tone. "Emily, please. There has to be another way. Can't we settle this privately? The lawyers are so expensive. Think of the scandal." "There's nothing to settle, Mom. You committed fraud. You chose to ruin me. Now you face the consequences you created. But we're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I'm your mother." I thought about the question for a long time, letting the silence convey the finality of my decision. "It used to mean everything, but you taught me what it actually means to you. It means someone to exploit, someone to manipulate. That's not family, Mom. That's a definition I can no longer accept." She was crying hysterically when I hung up the tears, finally for her own pain, not for mine. Vanessa's response was different. She sent me an email filled with accusations and self-pity, clinging to her entitlement. "You always had everything handed to you. I had to fight for scraps. And now you're destroying my life because you can't handle being used. You're the selfish one." I read it once and deleted it without response. Her inability to accept responsibility was absolute. The hardest moment came from an unexpected source. Tyler, Vanessa's ex-boyfriend from years ago, reached out via an old email I rarely checked. "I heard what happened. I just wanted you to know that you saved Megan back when things were bad. She still talks about how you helped her get those school supplies. She never knew where the money came from. Megan was Vanessa's daughter from her first marriage. I had helped support her when Vanessa was struggling sending money for clothes and school supplies, without telling anyone, ensuring the funds bypassed her mother. Tyler's message reminded me that not everything I had given was wasted. Some of it had reached people who actually needed help, people who were innocent. It was a single small point of light in the vast, dark history of my giving. In the final meeting with Daniel, he handed me a document to sign the victim statement that would formally close the investigation. I signed it without hesitation, my hand firm. Daniel looked at me with something like admiration. "You handled this with more strength than most people ever could, Emily. You reclaimed your identity in the middle of a war. I learned it the hard way. They taught me how to fight." 3 months passed. The investigation concluded. Legal proceedings moved forward, and the Carter family's financial world was definitively dismantled. And I began to build a new life, brick by brick. I moved to a different apartment in a neighborhood I had always admired but never thought I could afford: a sun-filled modern place with large windows and no shadows of guilt attached. Without the constant severe drain of supporting my family, my finances had recovered remarkably. I could afford nice things now. More importantly, I could afford to think about my own future, to invest in my own security and happiness. The job offer came through in February. Senior analyst at a competing firm with better pay and better prospects. I had been afraid to apply for positions like this before, subconsciously worried about what would happen to my family if I advanced too far, if I became truly unavailable. Now I accepted without hesitation, recognizing that my only responsibility was to my own growth. My father called one evening, his voice weak and tired, filled with resignation. "Emily, I wanted to apologize. I know I should have done more. I should have stopped them. I failed you." I listened without interrupting, allowing him the dignity of his own admission. When he finished, I said what I had been thinking for months, setting the final immovable boundary. "I appreciate you calling Dad. I truly hope you can rebuild your life and find some stability. But you can't rely on me anymore. I can't be your safety net." He accepted this with a sigh of resignation. Perhaps it was all he had expected. The end of a very long, exhausting performance. Vanessa sent one more email, half apology, half self-justification, but I opened it, read the first paragraph of self-pitying accusations, and then permanently blocked her email address, phone number, and all social media accounts. Forgiveness might come someday, but it would not come through a computer screen, and it wouldn't be granted until genuine remorse was shown. My mother never reached out. I learned through family friends that she was dealing with the severe legal consequences of her actions, and that she blamed everyone except herself, a final, stubborn confirmation of her pathological narcissism. Aunt Linda received her civil fine and disappeared from my life entirely, a ghost from a past crime. Her final message was bitter, but I deleted it without reading past the first line. On a Saturday morning in late spring, I walked through a park near my new apartment. The trees were blooming, the air was warm and clean, and the city felt alive in a way I had forgotten it could. I wasn't watching the snow fall outside my window anymore. I was walking in the light. I thought about the person I had been a year ago, the woman who would have done anything to keep her family happy, the woman who believed love meant sacrifice without limit, the woman who had no boundaries because she did not believe she deserved them. That woman was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who understood that love without respect was not love at all. Someone who knew her own worth measured not by her bank account, but by her integrity. My phone buzzed with a notification, bonus approved. The first recognition I had ever received for my work alone, not filtered through the needs of others. It was a professional validation that felt infinitely more valuable than any thank you I had never received from my family. I smiled and kept walking, feeling the sunlight on my face. Epilogue. A message to those who recognize this story. If you are reading this story, maybe you recognize something in it. Maybe you have been the person who gives everything while receiving nothing. Maybe you have been told that your sacrifices are never enough, that your worth is measured only by what you can provide to others. If that is you, I want you to know something. You deserve better. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just what you can give. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect, not exploitation. Walking away from my family was the hardest thing I ever did, but staying would have destroyed me. Sometimes the bravest choice is to stop trying to save people who do not want to be saved. The bravest choice is to save yourself. I am not angry anymore. The anger burned itself out months ago, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. What remains is something quieter, sadness for what could have been, acceptance of what is, and hope for what comes next. My life is my own now. The future I build will be built for myself, not for people who saw me as a resource to be depleted. The love I give will go to people who give it back. They told me to step away, so I did. And in stepping away, I finally found myself. If this story made you think about your own limits, your own boundaries, your own right to be treated with dignity, I would like to hear from you. Share your experience. You are not alone in this struggle. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this story with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind someone that they deserve better. Thank you for listening. Take care.